Dark shadows gathered over England in the first days of the year 1066. Winter had gripped the land with a deathly hold, but the real cold emanated not from the frozen soil, but from the royal chambers at Westminster. There on a bed surrounded by candles whose flickering light snatched the troubled faces of courtiers and priests from the gloom, King Edward, known as the Confessor, was fading. His breath was intermittent, his words as vague as the prophecies of the Delphic oracle. He was pious but childless, and his legacy, the crown of a prosperous yet vulnerable kingdom, hung in the air like the sword of Damocles. In this room, steeped in the scent of incense and fear, the threads of fate of 3 men, 3 peoples, 3 worlds were intertwined. None of those present could have known that the dying king's faint exhale would become the gust of a hurricane wind that would sweep across Europe, uproot 1,000-year-old traditions and build a new nation on blood and iron. This year, 1066, before it had truly begun, was already pregnant with war. And at the center of this gathering storm stood 3 men, a powerful English earl, a ruthless Norwegian king, and an ambitious Norman duke. Each of them believed that the crown of England belonged to him by right. History would judge them on the field of battle. This story is not just an account of one battle. It is a saga of a clash of civilizations. It is a narrative of how the worlds of Vikings, Anglo-Saxons, and Franco-Normans converged at a single point to give birth to something entirely new. It is a story of oaths and betrayals, of holy relics and bloody axes, of great ambitions and tragic fates. It is the story of William, the illegitimate son of a duke, nicknamed the Bastard, who by the force of his will and the sharpness of his sword forged a name for himself that would enter eternity: William the Conqueror. To understand the scale of his deed, we must descend into the depths of time and see the world as it was in the mid-11th century, a world on the threshold of great changes. Before we turn our gaze across the English Channel to the continent, where the character of the future conqueror was being forged, it is necessary to understand what the land that became the object of his indomitable passion represented. England in the mid-11th century was not a wild fringe of Europe. On the contrary, it was one of the richest, most organized, and culturally developed states of its time, a precious prize worth fighting for to the death. The roots of Anglo-Saxon England went back to the misty times of the fall of the Roman Empire, when the Germanic tribes of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes crossed the sea and pushed the Celtic Britons to the western fringes of the island. Over centuries of wars and assimilation, they created a mosaic of 7 kingdoms, the Heptarchy. But true unity was forged in the crucible of another threat, the Viking invasions. The great heathen army of the Danes in the 9th century nearly consumed all of England, but Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, stood in its way. He did not just stop them. He laid the foundations of a unified English state. He built burhs, fortified towns that became administrative and commercial centers. He reformed the army, creating the fyrd, a militia divided into 2 parts, one of which was always under arms while the other tilled the land. He revived learning and culture, inviting scholars from all over Europe. It was Alfred who transformed England from a conglomerate of tribal kingdoms into a unified whole, conscious of itself. By the year 1066, this legacy had blossomed magnificently. The English economy was remarkably developed. Unlike most of continental Europe, where barter dominated, England had a powerful monetary system. Over 70 royal mints struck silver pennies of the highest standard, which were valued throughout northern Europe. This stable currency fostered prosperous trade. English wool, considered the best in the world, was sent to Flanders, where it was woven into luxurious cloths. tin, lead, cheese, and slaves were exported from England, while wine from France, furs from Scandinavia, and spices and silk from the distant east were imported. The administrative system was a model of efficiency. The kingdom was divided into counties or shires, each governed by a royal sheriff responsible for tax collection, justice, and summoning the militia. This system allowed for the collection of huge revenues, making the English king one of the richest monarchs in Europe. The social structure was complex and hierarchical. At the top was the king, whose power, however, was not absolute. He ruled with the assistance of the Witenagemot, or assembly of wise men, which included the most influential people in the kingdom, the earls and the high clergy. The earls were powerful magnates who governed vast territories comparable to entire duchies on the continent. They had their own troops and treasuries. Below them stood the thanes, a class of service nobility who held land in exchange for military service to the king. These were professional warriors, the backbone of the Anglo-Saxon army. The foundation of society was the free peasants, the chorls, who owned their own plots of land and formed the basis of the fyrd. There were also slaves, the theos, but their numbers were gradually decreasing under the influence of the church. England's military organization was unique and formidable. Its core was the housecarls, the elite royal guard introduced by the Danish king Knut the Great, who had ruled England in the early 11th century. These were professional warriors armed to the teeth whose main weapon was the huge two-handed Danish axe, capable of splitting both shield and helmet with a single blow. They fought on foot, forming an unbreakable shield wall, a dense formation that was almost impossible to break with a cavalry charge. This elite was supported by the fyrd, a militia consisting of thanes and ceorls. Although the fyrd was less professional, its warriors were brave and devoted defenders of their land. England also possessed a powerful fleet, capable of controlling coastal waters and repelling Viking raids. Cultural life was no less rich. Anglo-Saxon literature in Old English was one of the most developed in Europe. The epic poem Beowulf, elegiac verses, lives of saints, and historical chronicles, all were created and copied in monastic scriptoria. The art of manuscript illumination reached incredible heights, and Anglo-Saxon jewelers and carvers in bone were famous for their craftsmanship. The church played a central role in society. England was a deeply Christian country with ancient monasteries and numerous saints. It was the piety of King Edward the Confessor, his desire to build an abbey at Westminster to rival the greatest churches of Rome, that largely predetermined the coming events. Thus, England was not just an island at the edge of the world. It was a stable, rich, well-governed kingdom with a strong army, a developed economy, and a distinctive culture. But this paradise had an Achilles heel. Its political system, dependent on the balance of power between the king and the powerful earls, was fragile. And most importantly, its pious king had no heir. This void on the throne turned the prosperous kingdom into a tempting prunus, attracting predatory glances from across the sea. And while this dynastic crisis was brewing in England, on the other side of the narrow channel, which the English called the English Channel and the French the La Manche, a completely different civilization was gaining strength, forged from the fury of the north and the sophistication of the south. This was the Duchy of Normandy, the land of the Northmen, the Norsemen. Normandy's history had begun only a century and a half before the events described in the year 911. At that time, hordes of Vikings under the mighty chieftain Rollo, also known as Hrolf the Walker, so nicknamed for his great height which no horse could carry, terrorized the northern coast of the Frankish kingdom. They burned cities, plundered monasteries, and spared no one in their path. The king of West Francia, Charles III the Simple, unable to defeat them by force, took an unprecedented step. He offered Rollo a deal. The Viking would receive vast lands at the mouth of the Seine in fief, acknowledge himself a vassal of the French king, accept Christianity, and undertake to protect the kingdom from raids by other Vikings. Legend has it that when Rollo was asked to kiss the king's foot as a sign of vassalage, the proud Viking refused and ordered one of his warriors to do it. The warrior, without bending, seized the royal foot and lifted it so high to his lips that Charles the Simple toppled from his throne to the laughter of the barbarians. This anecdote, though perhaps fictional, perfectly reflects the essence of the Norman character. They adopted the French language, French laws, the French religion, and French feudal customs, but they did so on their own terms. They ceased to be Vikings but retained their indomitable energy, belligerence, and thirst for glory and wealth. They became the Normans, the most dynamic and aggressive people in 11th century Europe. In a century and a half, they transformed a ravaged land into one of the most powerful and organized feudal states. Unlike the loose structure of Anglo-Saxon England, where the power of the earls challenged the king, Normandy was a model of centralized feudal rule. The duke was the absolute master of his lands. He distributed lands to his barons but demanded strict military service from them and did not allow them to build castles without his permission. This rigid system allowed the duke to mobilize a huge and disciplined army in a very short time. It was the army that was the main achievement and main instrument of the Normans. They perfected the art of warfare. Their main strike force was heavily armed knightly cavalry. A Norman knight was a veritable killing machine. Clad from head to toe in a mail hauberk, with a high conical helmet with a nasal guard covering his face, he sat on a specially trained warhorse. In one hand he held a long kite-shaped shield and in the other a lance, which he learned to couch under his arm, turning the entire mass of rider and horse into a single charging ram. This charge was capable of breaking any infantry line, including the famous Anglo-Saxon shield wall. In addition to knights, the Norman army included large detachments of archers, whose arrows could disrupt enemy ranks before a decisive attack, and infantry consisting of mercenaries and militiamen. Another key to their success was the construction of castles. It was the Normans who spread the technology of building motte and bailey castles throughout Europe. This was a simple but brilliant structure. A high artificial mound, the motte, was raised, on top of which a wooden and later stone keep was built. At the foot of the mound was an enclosed courtyard, or bailey, where outbuildings were located. Such a castle could be erected in a few weeks, and it became a stronghold controlling the entire surrounding area. Having conquered a territory, the Normans immediately built a castle, and it was almost impossible to dislodge them from it. The Normans were not only warriors, but also skilled administrators, jurists, and churchmen. They reformed the church in their duchy, inviting learned monks and building magnificent abbeys. Their boundless energy drove them far beyond Normandy. Detachments of Norman knights in search of glory and booty traveled to southern Italy, where they conquered Sicily from the Arabs and created their own kingdom. They fought the Moors in Spain and served as mercenaries in the Byzantine Empire. They were everywhere, and everywhere they succeeded. In the mid-11th century, this vibrant, aggressive, perfectly organized war machine was led by a man who was the embodiment of all Norman virtues and vices. His name was William. While the great powers of the time, the Holy Roman Empire, France, England, lived their own lives in the heart of Normandy, in the castle of Falaise, a boy was growing up who was destined to redraw the map of Europe. His path to power was not just difficult. It was paved with blood, betrayal, and a constant struggle for survival. His name was William, and the stigma of his birth became his greatest strength. He was born around the year 1028. His father was Robert I, Duke of Normandy, and his mother was Herleva, the daughter of a simple tanner from the town of Falaise. Robert was not married to Herleva, which made William illegitimate, a bastard. In those times, this was a serious stain on one's reputation, and William's enemies would contemptuously call him William the Bastard until the end of his days. Legend has it that when Herleva was pregnant, she dreamed that a great tree grew from her womb, its branches covering both Normandy and England. Another legend tells that the newborn William, placed on straw on the floor, grasped handfuls of it in his tiny fists with such force that they could not be opened. The midwife saw this as an omen. This child has begun to seize things from birth. He will be a great conqueror. In 1035, his father, Duke Robert, decided to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Before leaving, foreseeing that he might not return, he gathered all his barons and made them swear allegiance to his only son, the 7-year-old William. The barons reluctantly agreed. Robert indeed died on his way back from the Holy Land, and Normandy plunged into chaos. For young William, terrible years began. The Norman barons, barely restrained by Robert's iron hand, immediately started an internecine war, trying to dispute the bastard's rights and grab a piece of ducal power for themselves. The boy's life hung by a thread. His guardians and protectors died one after another. One, Alan III, Duke of Brittany, was poisoned. Another, Gilbert of Brienne, was killed during a horse ride. The seneschal, Osborne, was stabbed to death right in William's bedroom while he slept. The boy's maternal uncle, Walter, was often forced to wake him at night and hide him in the huts of the poor to save him from assassins. These years of constant fear, when every meal could be poisoned and every shadow in the hallway could hide a murderer, did not break William. On the contrary, they hardened his character, made him suspicious, ruthless, secretive, and incredibly resolute. He learned to trust no one, to rely only on himself, and to strike first. When William turned 19, he decided it was time to reclaim his power. In 1047, the most powerful barons of western Normandy, joined by some of his relatives, united against him. They decided to finish off the bastard once and for all. William was in a desperate situation. Then he took a bold step. He turned for help to his suzerain, King Henry I of France. Henry, understanding that anarchy in Normandy weakened his own kingdom, agreed to help. The decisive battle took place in the valley of Val-ès-Dunes. William's and King Henry's army met the army of the rebellious barons. The battle was fierce. William fought in the front ranks like a simple knight. A chronicler tells that he personally unhorsed and nearly killed one of the rebel leaders. His bravery and command talent brought him a complete victory. After the Battle of Val-ès-Dunes, no one in Normandy dared to openly challenge his authority again. He cruelly punished the rebels, confiscating their lands and destroying their castles. He became the absolute master of his duchy. Once, while besieging the town of Alençon, the defenders hung raw animal hides on the walls and shouted, "Work for the tanner!" mocking his mother's origins. William swore a terrible oath that he would treat them as a butcher treats a tree. Taking the town, he ordered 32 prominent citizens to be seized, their hands and feet cut off, and these bloody remains thrown over the walls into the still unyielded castle. The horror this act caused forced the defenders to capitulate immediately. This episode vividly demonstrates the icy cruelty William was capable of to achieve his goals. In the following years, he strengthened his power. He made a profitable marriage with Matilda, the daughter of the powerful Count Baldwin V of Flanders. The Pope was initially against this marriage due to distant kinship, but William ignored the ban. Later, to atone for his sin, he and Matilda founded 2 magnificent abbeys in the city of Caen, one for men and one for women. This marriage brought him not only a loyal and intelligent wife, but also a powerful ally in the north. A crucial role in his entourage was played by his half-brothers, sons of his mother Herleva from her legal marriage. Odo, whom William made Bishop of Bayeux, and Robert, who became Count of Mortain. Odo was a man of indomitable energy, more a warrior than a priest, greedy, ambitious, but fanatically devoted to his half-brother. He would become one of the main pillars of the conquest. By the 1060s, William was at the peak of his power. He was about 35 years old. He was a tall, physically strong man with a stern face and a piercing gaze. He was pious, but his piety did not prevent him from being absolutely ruthless to his enemies. He was greedy for money and power, but at the same time a just ruler to those who obeyed him. He was a master of intrigue and long-term planning, and his gaze turned more and more across the sea to the north, where in the rich kingdom of England ruled his distant relative, the old and childless King Edward. William claimed that Edward, who had spent his youth in exile at the Norman court, had once promised him the English throne, and William was not one to forget such promises. He was biding his time. But William was not the only one who looked upon the English crown with desire. In England itself, there was a figure whose rights to the throne seemed far more obvious and legitimate to the local population. And far to the north, in the cold fjords of Norway, lived a man whose ambitions were no less than those of the Norman Duke. The fate of England was to be decided in the triangle of these three titans. The first and most obvious candidate was Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex. If William was a product of the Norman system, then Harold was the quintessence of the Anglo-Saxon nobility. His family, the House of Godwin, was the most powerful in England. His father, Godwin, had risen from an obscure thane to the position of the most influential earl under King Canute the Great and Edward the Confessor. After his father's death in 1053, Harold inherited his title and influence. By 1066, he was effectively the second most powerful man in the kingdom after the king. His lands in Wessex were the richest in England, and his brothers were also earls in other parts of the country. The Godwin family controlled almost all of southern and eastern England. Harold was the complete opposite of William. He was tall, handsome, charming, and generous. If William inspired fear, Harold evoked love and loyalty. He was not only a skilled politician, but also a brilliant military commander. In 1063, he conducted a lightning-fast and successful military campaign against the Welsh king Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, who had constantly raided England. Harold used tactics of quick strikes, cornering the Welsh in their mountain fortresses and eventually causing the Welsh themselves to kill their king and send his head to Harold. This victory brought him fame as the defender of the kingdom. He was married to King Edward's sister, which further strengthened his position. For most Englishmen, it was Harold, powerful, experienced, and connected to the royal family, who was the only logical successor to the childless Edward. He was one of their own, an Englishman who understood the needs of the country. But there was one shadow in his biography, one fateful episode that William of Normandy would use against him with crushing force. Around the year 1064, Harold's ship was wrecked off the coast of Normandy. He was taken prisoner by a local count, but William ransomed him and received him with great honor at his court. However, this honor was a trap. William forced Harold to swear an oath of allegiance to him. Norman chroniclers claim that Harold swore to support William's claim to the English throne. To make the oath unbreakable, William, they say, resorted to a trick. He had two large chests brought on which Harold pronounced the words of the oath. And after that he ordered the chests to be opened, which, to Harold's horror, were filled to the brim with the holiest relics from all over Normandy. An oath sworn on holy relics was considered absolutely sacred at that time, and its violation was the gravest sin, perjury. English sources either remain silent on this or say that the oath was extracted by force and had no legal validity. But for William, it didn't matter. He had acquired a most powerful propaganda weapon. The third claimant to the throne was a man who seemed to be a visitor from another, more ancient and ferocious era. His name was Harold Sigurdsson, king of Norway, better known by the nickname Hardrada, which means the stern or the hard ruler. His story was a true saga. In his youth, he was forced to flee Norway after his half-brother, King Olaf the Saint, was killed in battle. Harold found refuge in Kiev at the court of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, where he served in his retinue. From there, he went to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and entered the service of the famous Varangian Guard, an elite corps of mercenaries, the bodyguards of the Byzantine Emperor. For 10 years, Harold fought for the empire in Bulgaria, Sicily, and Asia Minor. He became famous for his bravery, cunning, and cruelty. He amassed immense wealth, plundering enemies and participating in palace intrigues. Legends tell of his incredible feats and daring escapes from captivity. Finally, having become one of the richest and most famous warriors of his time, he returned to Norway. With the help of his accumulated gold and his fearsome reputation, he forced his nephew, who then ruled Norway, to make him co-ruler, and after his nephew's death, he became sole king. Harald Hardrada was the embodiment of the Viking spirit. Tall, almost 2 meters, he was a ruthless warrior and an ambitious ruler. His claims to the English throne were the weakest from a legal standpoint. He based them on an old treaty between his predecessor and a Danish king who had ruled England before Edward. But for Hardrada, the main argument was not jurisprudence but force. He considered himself the heir to the great Viking kings like Knut the Great, who had ruled a North Sea empire that included Denmark, Norway, and England. He dreamed of restoring this empire, and he had an unexpected ally, Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own brother. Tostig had been Earl of Northumbria, but his rule was so cruel and unjust that the Northerners rebelled and exiled him. Harold, seeking to preserve the unity of the kingdom, supported the Northerners' decision, which Tostig considered a betrayal. Consumed by a thirst for revenge, he first tried to find an ally in William, but eventually went to Norway and convinced Hardrada that England was ready to fall into his hands like a ripe apple. And so, by the beginning of 1066, the stage was set. 3 great warriors, 3 ambitious leaders, each with his own army, his own history, and his own truth, were preparing for a clash over the richest prize in Europe. The dying King Edward may have whispered Harold's name on his deathbed, but the echo of his earlier promises to William was already thundering across the Channel. And from the north, the shadow of the dragon ships of the last great Viking was approaching. The year of the 3 kings was beginning. It seemed as if the cosmos itself foretold great upheavals. On January 5th, 1066, King Edward the Confessor breathed his last. Almost immediately, violating all traditions that required a long period of mourning, the Witenagemot convened and proclaimed Harold Godwinson as the new King of England. The very next day, January 6th, on the Feast of the Epiphany, his hasty coronation took place in the newly consecrated Westminster Abbey, the very one that had been the life's work of the late Edward. This act was a demonstration of strength and determination. Harold and his supporters understood that delay was fatal. It was necessary to show the whole world, and primarily William of Normandy, that England had a legitimate and strong ruler, but the heavens, it seemed, had their own opinion on the matter. In April of the same year, a terrifying sight appeared in the night sky over Europe. A bright star with a long, fiery tail hung over the world, instilling superstitious terror in the hearts of men. We now know it was Halley's Comet, but for people of the 11th century it was an undeniable omen of coming disasters, wars, and the fall of kingdoms. In England it was seen as a bad omen for the new king. On the famous Bayeux tapestry, which narrates these events, people are depicted pointing in horror at the comet, and nearby in his chambers a ghost appears to King Harold, foretelling his doom. News of Edward's death and Harold's coronation reached Normandy while Duke William was hunting in his forests near Rouen. A chronicler relates that upon hearing the news, he was struck dumb with rage. He returned to the palace, speaking to no one, and paced back and forth in the hall for a long time, tying and untying the knots on his cloak. His anger was not just the anger of a cheated claimant. It was the cold, calculated anger of a statesman who saw his long-term plan threatened. He immediately began to act. His first step was diplomatic. He sent an embassy to Harold reminding him of his oath and demanding that he yield the throne. Harold's response was predictable. He stated that the oath had been extracted by force and had no legal validity, and that he had been elected king by the will of the English people and nobility. The diplomatic path was exhausted. William began to prepare for war, but this was not just a war. It was an undertaking of colossal scale. To cross the English Channel with a huge army and cavalry was a nearly impossible task. It required hundreds of ships, thousands of warriors, and tons of provisions and armaments. Normandy alone could not provide such resources. William needed to turn his personal dynastic dispute into a pan-European enterprise, a kind of crusade, and he did so with brilliant insight. He launched a most powerful propaganda campaign. Throughout France, Flanders, Brittany, and even further afield, his emissaries told the story of the treacherous perjurer Harold, who had usurped a throne promised to a pious and legitimate heir. He promised land and riches in fertile England to all who would join his campaign. Knight adventurers from all over northern France, younger sons of barons with no hope of inheritance, flocked to his banners. But his main move was to appeal to the Pope. William, acting through his brilliant advisor Lanfranc, presented his case in Rome not as a war of conquest but as a sacred mission. He accused Harold of perjury on holy relics. He pointed out that the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stigand, had been appointed to his post illegally, bypassing papal authority, and that the English Church needed reform along continental lines. Pope Alexander II, who was himself a reformer and sought to strengthen Rome's authority, seized this opportunity. He sent the Duke a consecrated banner, a papal blessing for the invasion, and a ring with a holy relic. This was a decisive propaganda triumph. Now William was not just a greedy invader, but a soldier of Christ, fulfilling the will of God's vicar on earth. His adventure had turned into a holy war. All summer of 1066, work bustled on the coast of Normandy. Thousands of carpenters built the invasion fleet, hundreds of flat-bottomed ships capable of transporting not only warriors but also, critically, horses. Smiths forged swords, spears, and chainmail. Troops from all over Normandy and neighboring lands flocked to the camp at the mouth of the Dives River. By August, William had assembled a huge army for the time, from 7,000 to 12,000 men, including about 3,000 heavy cavalry. This was the most powerful military force Europe had seen in a long time. Everything was ready. William waited for only one thing: a favorable south wind to carry his fleet across the Channel. But the wind, as if on purpose, blew from the north, pinning his ships to the shore. Week after week passed, and the wind did not change. The army began to murmur, and while William was burning with impatience on the French coast, King Harold in England faced no less serious problems. He understood perfectly well that William's invasion was inevitable. All summer he kept his army, the Feigned and the Housecarls, in full combat readiness on the south coast, awaiting the appearance of the Norman fleet. His fleet patrolled the Channel, but the wait dragged on. By early September, the Feigned militiamen were running out of both provisions and patience. They had to be sent home for the harvest, otherwise the kingdom faced famine. On September 8th, having still not seen William, Harold was forced to disband his army and fleet. He watched with bitterness as his troops dispersed to their homes. He remained in London with only his guard of housecarls. It seemed the crisis had passed, at least for that year. This was his fatal mistake. Hardly had he disbanded the army when news arrived that chilled the blood in his veins. The invasion had begun, but not from the south, but from the north. A huge fleet, over 300 ships, under the leadership of Harald Hardrada and the rebellious Tostig Godwinson, had entered the mouth of the Humber River. The last great Viking expedition had begun. The Norwegians acted quickly and brutally. They plundered the coast and marched on York, the capital of the north. The local earls, Edwin and Morcar, went out to meet them with their militia. On September 20th at Fulford Gate, near York, a battle took place. The English fought bravely, but against Hardrada's battle-hardened veterans they had no chance. The army of the northern earls was utterly routed, and York surrendered to the victor's mercy. It seemed that all of northern England lay at the Norwegian king's feet. When news of the rout at Fulford reached Harold in London, he demonstrated the incredible energy and determination that made him a great leader. He did not wait to gather a new large army. He understood that there was no time to delay. Together with his loyal housecarls and those thanes he could quickly assemble along the way, he made one of the most famous forced marches in military history. In 4 days, his army covered nearly 300 kilometers from London to York, an incredible achievement for a foot army of that time. On September 25th, just 5 days after the Battle of Fulford, Harold's army suddenly appeared near the Norwegian camp. Hardrada and his warriors were caught completely by surprise. They did not expect the English king to appear so soon. Most of their army was resting in the camp near the ships. Many had not even put on their armor, enjoying the warm autumn day. Hardrada, with part of his force, was at a bridge over the River Derwent, at a place called Stamford Bridge, waiting for hostages to arrive from York. Seeing the approaching army, the Norwegians at first thought it was the promised hostages. But when thousands of helmets and spearheads glinted in the morning sun, they realized their mistake. A desperate battle began. The Norwegians, covering the retreat of their main forces, tried to hold the narrow wooden bridge. A legend, recorded in the Scandinavian sagas, tells of a giant Norwegian warrior berserker who single-handedly held the bridge against the entire English army. He hewed down all who tried to pass with his great axe and, according to tradition, slew 40 Englishmen. No one could overcome him. Then a resourceful English soldier floated under the bridge in a boat and speared the giant from below, through the gaps in the planking. The hero fell, and the way was open for the English. Harold's housecarls poured across the bridge and fell upon the main Viking army. The Norwegians, many of them without armor, formed their shield wall. Harald Hardrada himself, huge and furious, fought in the front ranks, inspiring his men. But suddenly a stray arrow struck him in the throat. The last great Viking fell to the ground. After his death, the battle turned into a slaughter. The English, avenging the defeat at Fulford, spared no one. By evening, almost the entire Norwegian army had been destroyed. Of the more than 300 ships that had come with Hardrada, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors back. Along with Hardrada, the traitor Tostig also fell. Harold had won a complete and crushing victory. He had saved England from the northern threat. He stood at the pinnacle of his glory. But he did not know that at the very moment he was celebrating victory, the very north wind he had so feared had finally died down. Just 3 days after Harold's triumph at Stamford Bridge, on September 28, 1066, the wind in the English Channel changed. For William, it was a sign from above. Without losing a moment, he gave the order to embark. All night his huge fleet, about 700 vessels, crossed the Channel. William's flagship, the Mora, A gift from his wife Matilda carried the consecrated papal banner on its mast. The next morning, September 29th, the Norman army landed without a single shot on the English shore at Pevensey Bay on the coast of Sussex. The English fleet was gone. The army was in the north. The south coast was defenseless. Legend has it that as he stepped ashore, William stumbled and fell face down in the sand. His knights froze in horror, seeing this as a bad omen. But William did not lose his composure. He sprang to his feet, clutching handfuls of earth and sand, and exclaimed, "By the splendor of God, I have already taken England in my hands." He had turned a bad omen into a symbol of future conquest. William did not advance inland. He set up camp near the town of Hastings, fortified it, and began to systematically ravage the surrounding lands which belonged personally to Harold. This was a calculated and cruel move. He was not just supplying his army with provisions, he was provoking Harold, throwing him a personal challenge, forcing him to come and give battle as soon as possible. News of the Norman landing reached Harold while he was still in York, celebrating his victory. The news was like a thunderclap. His army was exhausted from the battle at Stamford Bridge and the incredible forced march north. Now they had to make the same journey back south to face a new, even more formidable enemy. Many advised Harold not to rush. His brothers Gurth and Leofwine begged him to stay in London, gather fresh forces from all over England, and let them fight William. They said, "You gave an oath to William, even if under duress. We gave no oaths. We will fight for England, and you will save yourself for the future." But Harold was proud and impatient. He was the king, and he could not allow an invader to ravage his personal lands with impunity. He rejected his brother's advice and made a fateful decision: to march south immediately and give William a general battle. He again made an incredible forced march, covering 320 kilometers to London in less than a week. In London, he stayed for only a few days, gathering all the forces he could. Many of the feared units from the north who had suffered losses at Fulford and Stamford Bridge did not have time to join him. His army was tired and incomplete, but on October 12th, he marched out of London to meet his destiny. On the evening of October 13th, Harold's army reached the place he had chosen for the battle. It was a high ground, a hill about 10 kilometers north of William's camp at Hastings. The locals called this place Senlac, which in Old English means sandy stream. The hill had steep slopes in front and on the sides, making it an ideal defensive position, especially against cavalry. On top of this hill, Harold ordered his warriors to form up for battle. The English army numbered from 7,000 to 8,000 men, about the same as William's. But its composition was different. The corps consisted of 2,000 to 3,000 elite housecarls and thanes, clad in mail with large shields and fearsome Danish axes. The rest was the feared, militiamen armed with spears, swords, and some with just clubs and stones. The entire army was on foot. They formed the traditional shield wall, a dense, multi-layered phalanx, bristling with spears. This formation was almost impenetrable as long as it maintained its integrity. In the center, under his personal standard, the fighting man, and the banner of Wessex with a golden dragon, stood King Harold himself with his brothers Gurth and Leofwine and the best housecarls. Their plan was simple: to stand to the death on the hilltop, repel the Norman attacks, wear them down, and then perhaps counterattack. On the morning of October 14th, the Norman army marched out of Hastings. William, according to tradition, mistakenly put on his mail hauberk backward, which again caused dismay among his men. But he just laughed and said, "The strength of my duchy will be turned into the strength of a kingdom." He arranged his army in 3 lines. In the first were the archers and crossbowmen, whose task was to shower the English with arrows and disrupt their ranks. In the second, the heavy infantry who were to engage in hand-to-hand combat. And behind, in the third line, was his main force. The knightly cavalry divided into three wings, the Bretons on the left flank, the Normans in the center under William's own command, and the French and Flemings on the right. William's plan was as simple as Harold's, to break the shield wall and destroy the English army. The sun rose over Senlac Hill. Two armies, two civilizations, two destinies stood facing each other. Priests on both sides read prayers. Warriors checked their weapons. The air was electrified with tension. The battle that would decide the fate of England for 1,000 years was about to begin. At 9 o'clock on the morning of October 14th, 1066, the piercing blare of Norman trumpets sounded in the air. The Battle of Hastings had begun. William's archers went into the attack first. Thousands of arrows flew into the sky in a black cloud and rained down on the English ranks. But the shield wall was almost invulnerable. The English locked their large, round and kite-shaped shields over their heads, and most arrows either bounced off or harmlessly stuck in the wood. Moreover, the English stood on high ground and the archers had to shoot upwards, which reduced the force and accuracy of their shots. Volley after volley produced no visible result. The shield wall stood unshaken. Then William threw his infantry into the battle. Under the cover of the continuing barrage, Norman and mercenary infantrymen, armed with spears and swords, rushed up the slope. They crashed with fury into the shield wall. A horrifying hand-to-hand struggle began. The clang of steel on steel, the crack of shattering shields, the hoarse cries of the attackers, and the furious roar of the defenders merged into one monstrous din. But here, too, the English had the advantage. They stood higher, striking downwards, and their fearsome Danish axes worked true wonders. A single blow from such an axe, wielded by a strong housecarl, could split both a rider and his horse in two. The Norman infantry suffered horrendous losses. Rolling back, they left hundreds of their dead and wounded on the slope of the hill. It was now the turn of William's main trump card, the knightly cavalry. Spurring their horses, the knights charged. The earth trembled under the hooves of thousands of war horses. It was a terrifying sight, but it too shattered against the unbreakable shield wall. The horses shied away from the dense wall of spears and axes. The knights, unable to gain the necessary speed on the ascent, could not deliver their famous couched lance charge. The English, standing their ground, stabbed the horses and pulled the riders to the ground, where they were immediately finished off. The attack faltered. On the left flank, where the Bretons attacked, something happened that nearly became a catastrophe for William. Unable to withstand the fierce resistance, the Bretons wavered and fled down the slope. Seeing this, a part of the English on the right flank, mostly inexperienced Fyrd militiamen, disobeyed Harold's order not to leave their positions. Intoxicated by success, they rushed with cries in pursuit of the retreating enemy. It was a fatal mistake. At this critical moment, a panic-stricken rumor swept through the Norman ranks. "The Duke is slain!" William, seeing his army on the brink of complete rout, performed another act of personal bravery. He tore off his helmet so that all could see his face and galloped along his ranks, shouting, "Look at me! I live, and with God's help I shall yet win the victory!" Seeing their leader alive, the Norman spirits rose. William personally led a counterattack against the English who had rashly come down from the hill. Finding themselves on level ground, far from the saving shield wall, they were surrounded and completely annihilated by the knightly cavalry. But this local disaster taught William something important. He saw the English weakness, their indiscipline and their tendency to pursue a retreating enemy, and he decided to turn this weakness into his tactic. Over the next few hours, the Normans repeated the same maneuver time and again. Their knights would attack the shield wall, fight for a short while, and then feign a panicked flight. And each time, despite Harold's shouts and orders, individual groups of Englishmen would break from their positions and rush in pursuit, falling into the same trap. On the level field, they were surrounded and exterminated by the Norman cavalry. It was a brutal war of attrition. Slowly but surely, the shield wall melted away. It still stood, but gaps were appearing which had to be plugged by pulling warriors from other sectors. The battle had been raging for over 6 hours. The men were exhausted. The slopes of the hill were covered with the bodies of men and horses. At some point in the battle, Harold's brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, fell. They had fought like lions at the foot of the hill and were killed, which was a heavy blow to the English and to the king personally. But Harold continued to fight, standing by his standard, inspiring his remaining warriors. By evening, as the sun was setting, William realized that something decisive had to be done. He again ordered his archers to open fire, but this time he gave them a different order. To shoot not directly but in a high arc, so that the arrows would fall on the English from above, striking them in their unprotected faces and necks. This tactic proved effective. The shield wall could not protect against such a barrage. The English suffered losses and fell into confusion. It was at this moment, under a rain of arrows, that the decisive episode of the battle occurred. What exactly happened to King Harold is still debated by historians. The Norman version, depicted on the Bayeux tapestry, states that a stray arrow struck him in the eye. On the embroidery, we see a figure with the inscription, "King Harold is slain, clutching his eye, pierced by an arrow." Other sources, including later ones, claim that he was not killed by an arrow but was attacked by a group of Norman knights who broke through to the royal standard. They allegedly cut him down with their swords, inflicting terrible wounds. Perhaps both versions are true. Wounded in the eye by an arrow, he was finished off by knights. Whatever the case, with the death of the king, the spirit of the English army broke. The shield wall, which had held for 9 long hours, finally disintegrated. The leader's death, fatigue, and terror did their work. The battle turned into a slaughter. The housecarls, true to their oath, defended their king's body to the last, but they were all cut down. The remnants of the feared fled under the cover of approaching darkness, pursued closely by the Norman cavalry. The Battle of Hastings was over. William of Normandy was victorious. The next day, William ordered his fallen to be buried. The bodies of the English were left on the battlefield for looters and wild beasts. According to tradition, Harold's mother, Geitha, offered William her son's weight in gold for his body. But William refused, stating that one who had broken a holy oath did not deserve a Christian burial. The king's body was so mutilated that only his common-law wife, Edith Swanneck, could identify it by certain secret marks known only to her. According to one version, he was secretly buried in the church he had founded at Waltham. According to another, he was simply thrown from a cliff into the sea. England was left without a king. The way to London was open. The victory at Hastings did not mean the immediate conquest of all of England. It was only the first, albeit decisive, battle. The English elite, including the surviving Earls Edwin and Morcar, as well as the archbishops, gathered in London. They were not ready to surrender. They proclaimed the young Edgar Atheling, Edward the Confessor's grandnephew and the last representative of the ancient Wessex dynasty, as the new king. But Edgar was young, weak, and had no real power. The resistance was more an act of desperation than a real plan. William, instead of marching directly on London, used tactics of intimidation and strangulation. He marched with his army in a wide circle through Kent, Surrey, and Hampshire, burning and ravaging everything in his path. He captured key towns such as Winchester, where the royal treasury was located. His army left a scorched earth behind it. This was a demonstration of power. He was showing the English what would happen to them if they did not submit. By December, the ring around London had closed. The city was cut off from food supplies. The English leaders, seeing the futility of further resistance and fearing the complete destruction of the capital, decided to surrender. At Berkhamsted, a delegation of English nobility, including the young King Edgar, Earls Edwin and Morcar, and Archbishop Stigand, met William. They swore allegiance to him and offered him the crown. William accepted their offer. The coronation was set for Christmas Day, December 25th, 1066, at Westminster Abbey. This was a symbolic act. William wanted to show that he was the legitimate successor of Edward the Confessor, being crowned in the same place and on the same holy day. The ceremony was conducted in 2 languages. Archbishop Ealdred of York, an Englishman, addressed the assembled Anglo-Saxons and asked if they accepted William as their king. They responded with loud cries of approval. Then Bishop Geoffrey of Coutances, a Norman, asked the same question in French to the Normans, and they too responded with an enthusiastic roar. But it was at this moment that everything went wrong. The Norman soldiers, standing outside the abbey and not understanding English, heard the loud shouts from inside. They thought their duke was being attacked, that the English had rebelled. In panic, they rushed to set fire to the nearby houses. Panic erupted in the abbey. People, frightened by the fire and the thought of a massacre, rushed to the exits. In the chaos and smoke, surrounded by only a few terrified priests, William, trembling with fear and anger, was hastily crowned by Archbishop Ealdred. Thus, to the accompaniment of screams and the crackle of fire, the era of Norman rule in England began. The coronation, intended as a symbol of reconciliation and legitimacy, had turned into a symbol of the violence and fear that would henceforth be associated with the new regime. The conquest had only just begun. The coronation did not bring peace to England. The conquest was not a single act. It stretched over 5 long and bloody years, and at 1067 William felt so confident that he returned to Normandy to celebrate his triumph, leaving England in the care of his half-brother Odo of Bayeux and William Fitz-Osbern. This was a mistake. Their cruel and greedy rule provoked a wave of rebellions across the country. The most serious resistance flared up in the north. In 1069, a powerful rebellion arose in Northumbria. The rebels, supported by a fleet from the Danish king Sweyn Estridsson, who also had claims to the English throne, captured York and slaughtered the 3,000-strong Norman garrison. William's response was horrific. It went down in history as the harrying of the North. Having lost patience with the constant rebellions, he decided to teach the Northerners a lesson they would never forget. In the winter of 1069 to 1070, his armies marched through all of Northumbria, from York to Durham, applying scorched earth tactics on the most monstrous scale. They burned villages and towns, destroyed crops, slaughtered livestock, and broke tools. They were not just suppressing a rebellion, they were systematically destroying the very possibility of life in the territory. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, himself half Norman, wrote, "Never had William shown such cruelty. In his anger, he commanded that all crops and herds, all tools and food be destroyed. More than 100,000 people, men, women, and children, died of starvation." The land was so devastated that, according to chroniclers, it remained a desolate wasteland for many years. It was an act of genocide that forever broke the North's will to resist. But even after this, pockets of defiance remained. The last bastion of Anglo-Saxon freedom was the Isle of Ely in the marshy fens region. All the discontented flocked there, led by a legendary thane named Hereward the Wake. For a year, Hereward and his men, using their excellent knowledge of the terrain, waged a guerrilla war against the Normans, making daring raids. William had to gather huge forces and build a 2-mile causeway through the swamps to reach the rebels. In 1071, the stronghold fell. The fate of Hereward himself is unknown. According to some legends, he died, According to others, he escaped and continued the fight. But with the fall of Ely, organized Anglo-Saxon resistance was broken. To keep the conquered country in submission, William began a grand program of castle building. All over England, Norman motte and bailey castles sprang up like mushrooms. They were built in strategically important locations. The Tower of London, castles in Winchester, Norwich, York, all were founded in the early years of William's reign. These castles were not just defensive structures, they were symbols of the new power. Stone fists that held the conquered population in fear. From these castles, Norman lords ruled their new domains. Parallel to the castle building, another no less important change was taking place: the complete replacement of the ruling class. William systematically confiscated the lands of the Anglo-Saxon nobility and distributed them to his Norman, French, and Flemish comrades in arms. By the end of his reign, almost all the land in England belonged to just a few hundred Norman barons. The Anglo-Saxon thanes had either died in battle or been stripped of everything and turned into exiles or small tenants. The entire top of society, secular and ecclesiastical, became French-speaking. The pinnacle of William's administrative genius and a symbol of total control over the new country was the creation of the Domesday Book in 1086. Concerned that he did not know the exact resources of his kingdom and wanting to collect taxes as efficiently as possible, William ordered a general land survey. Royal commissioners were sent all over England. They were to find out for each manor who owned it in King Edward's time, who owns it now, how much land there is, how many plows, how many peasants, slaves, how much meadow, forest, pasture, how many mills, fish ponds. They had to assess what the manor was worth before and what it is worth now. This survey was unprecedented in its scale and thoroughness. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle writes, "He had it investigated so very narrowly that there was not one single hide nor a yard of land, nor even, it is shameful to tell, though it seemed to him no shame to do, an ox, nor a cow, nor a swine was left that was not set down in his writ." To the English, this looked like the prelude to the Last Judgment, when everyone would have to account for their deeds, hence the name, the Domesday Book. For William, however, it was an ideal instrument of governance. Now he knew exactly what resources his kingdom possessed and how much he could take from whom. This book is a unique historical document, giving us an incredibly detailed snapshot of 11th century England. It is also an epitaph for the old Anglo-Saxon world, which was completely swept away by the conquest. William the Conqueror died in 1087 during a campaign in France. Ironically, his death was as prosaic as his life was epic. His horse stumbled on the hot embers of a burning town, and the pommel of the saddle struck the king hard in the stomach, causing internal bleeding. His end was gruesome. As soon as he breathed his last, his servants plundered everything in the room, including the clothes from his body, and left him naked on the floor. His huge, corpulent body could hardly be squeezed into the sarcophagus, and in the process it burst, filling the church with an unbearable stench. It seemed that even after death, humiliation similar to that he had experienced at birth awaited him. But his legacy was truly grandiose. The Norman Conquest was not just a change of dynasty. It was a tectonic shift that changed England forever and set its history on a completely new path. Firstly, there was a complete reorientation of England from the north to the south. Before 1066, England was part of the Scandinavian world. Its ties with Denmark and Norway were stronger than with the continent. After the conquest, England became part of the French-speaking world. Its politics, trade, and culture were now inextricably linked with France and continental Europe. This predetermined centuries of rivalry and at times alliances with France, including the 100 Years' War. Secondly, a powerful centralized feudal monarchy was established in England. All land now formally belonged to the king, and all landowners were his direct vassals. This gave the English kings a fullness of power that no other monarch in Europe possessed. This system, laid down by William, became the basis for the future strong English state, and paradoxically for the development of English common law, which was uniform for the entire country. Thirdly, the conquest led to the birth of a new language and a new culture. For several centuries, two languages existed in England. The ruling elite spoke Anglo-Norman, a dialect of French, while the common people spoke Old English. Gradually, these two languages merged, giving birth to Middle English, the direct ancestor of modern English. A huge number of French words related to governance, such as parliament, government, law, e.g. to judge, justice, war, including army, soldier, fashion, e.g. fashion, and cuisine, with words like beef, pork, entered the English language forever. The Normans also brought their architecture, majestic Romanesque cathedrals and abbeys, such as those in Durham or Norwich, which still impress with their power and beauty today. William himself, after becoming king, did not turn into a benevolent ruler. He remained stern and often cruel. He was passionate about hunting and for its needs ordered the eviction of thousands of people and the demolition of dozens of villages in Hampshire to create his personal hunting reserve. The New Forest. Draconian forest laws were introduced to protect game, punishing the killing of a deer with death, which aroused the hatred of the local population. His family life was also full of drama. His eldest son, Robert, nicknamed Curthose, meaning short stockings, constantly rebelled against him, demanding power, and once even wounded his own father in battle. Even his most loyal comrades could fall victim to his wrath. His half-brother, Bishop Odo, who had become the second richest man in England after the king, became so proud and wealthy that he allegedly began to dream of the papal tiara and started recruiting knights for a campaign in Italy. Learning of this, William was furious. In 1082, he personally arrested Odo. When the bishop claimed his inviolability as a clergyman, William replied, "I am not arresting the Bishop of Bayeux, but the Earl of Kent," and threw his brother in prison, where he remained until William's death. This episode shows that the conqueror tolerated no authority but his own. The Norman Conquest was brutal and bloody. It brought death, devastation, and oppression to an entire people. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was destroyed, and the free peasants were largely enserfed. But from this fire and violence, from the clash of two worlds, a new nation was born. A nation in which Anglo-Saxon resilience and love of liberty combined with Norman energy, organizational skills, and martial spirit. This nation built the greatest empire in history and had an enormous influence on the entire world. And at the center of this grandiose historical drama stands the figure of William, the bastard, the Duke, the Conqueror. He was a ruthless tyrant, but at the same time a brilliant ruler and commander. Driven by insatiable ambition, he stopped at nothing to achieve his goal. He was a product of his cruel time, but he also shaped that time. His life is an eternal reminder of what human genius, will, and ambition are capable of, and an eternal warning of the terrible price sometimes paid for greatness, and how thin the line is between a savior and a tyrant, between building a new world and destroying an old one. A man who once fell on the English shore and, clutching the seamed in his hands, proclaimed that land his own and made it his forever.